Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to go over the Thomas test with you, and that can be found on page 424 under the muscular training, the assessment. So, kind of what's the purpose of the Thomas test? And the objective here is to evaluate the length of the muscles involved in hip flexion, i.e., hip flexors, and the rectus femoris. Real quick, remember the rectus femoris is a two joint muscle. That means it crosses over the knee and is involved in knee extension. And of course, it crosses over the hip. So it's involved in hip flexion. I will say this. Generally, the Thomas test is used by clinicians, athletic trainers, even physicians, sports med guys, physical therapists, physiotherapists, people like that. And if they want to get really technical with it, they'll use what's known as a goniometer to measure the actual angles that we're seeing. The point of the test is not to do the Thomas test and get some information and you go from there. Generally, the understanding is that you're doing these assessments because you're evaluating doing things for a week, 2 weeks, a month, and then re-evaluating. So one of the things that you can determine or interpret from the Thomas test is number one, you got tight hip flexors, okay, or the rectus femoris is tight versus the iliopsoas muscles, right? So if you got tight hip flexors, is it the iliopsoas muscle, right, which is strictly related to the hip joint itself, or is it the rectus femoris, one of the quadricep muscles that acts as a hip flexor as well? And when you do the Thomas test, you can get a pretty good idea. It's pretty simple, straightforward, and you can see it. It's pretty much straight out in front of you what's going on. If this happens, it's probably this muscle is tight. If this happens, it's probably this one is tight. So you can get a quick and simple diagnosis, so to speak, of where the tightness is coming from. So that's the one thing that it does for you. Then, of course, you can measure when you do it again. If you're going to use what's known as a goniometer, just measures the angle between body segments, and that's what it's doing. You can see if you made progress from one test to the next, which is always good. It's good to have some objective data. But the whole point of the Thomas test is to get an idea of how tight or not the hip flexors or the primary hip flexors, how tight they are, right? So the iliopsoas and the rectus femoris. And if you know one is tight versus the other, or that one's tight and the other one is not tight, then you can do the sort of corrective type of exercises, stretching, things like that. So again, 424, you basically have to have somebody sitting on a table. One of the key things, the proper way to do this is to have the person, I like to have the client kind of sit all the way to not to where their butt is at the end of the bench, but if they were to sit with their butt at the very end of the bench, you would move them back a little bit. So the back half of the thighs are still on the bench. I think Ace will tell you, instruct the client to sit at the end of the table with the mid thigh aligned with the table edge. So, and you can see that picture, the starting position on figure 1037. I like to have my clients go a little bit further. So they're a little bit further off the bench. So that allows for that bottom leg that's staying in position to be able to fall over, so to speak, to fall down more appropriately if they are pretty flexible. You don't want, here's the point, is you don't want the table to impede extension at the hip for that leg that's still on the table, because it could do that. And so the idea then is you have your client sit up, and you can see that in the picture. They can either grab around their knee with the leg, the leg that you're doing first, or underneath it, whatever works. And then basically you kind of hold them. You tell them to pull their knee up to their chest. And as they do that, they're going to kind of rock back until they are lying on the bench, as you can see in the second part of that figure in the test position. And essentially what you're doing is you're looking up underneath to make sure that they're pulling their knee. One leg is down, one knee is pulled to their chest. You don't want them to like pull it way into their chest. You have them pull enough to where when you look underneath, you can see that the lordotic curve, that lumbar spinal lordotic curve, has been eliminated. So that's what pulling the knee into the right, flexing that hip with that one leg, that unilateral flexion of the hip will flatten out the lower back. Once that position is reached, you're not doing anything there. You're looking now on the other side to the leg that is hanging, essentially hanging off the bench. And that's where you're going to do your observation and your assessment. So observe whether the back of the lowered thigh touches the table, hips position in 10 degrees of extension, and observe whether the knee of the lowered leg achieves 90 degrees of flexion. This is the key. That's why it's a really good test because it tells you something. You think that you're really tight in hip flexors. Well, yeah, maybe, but it might not be the iliopsoas complex. It might actually be the rectus femoris, and you'd have to stretch your quads out more, right? Because if when the person lies back, the foot comes forward, right? They cannot flex the knee at the bottom, or if the knee just kind of rides forward and the foot comes up, we know that the rectus femoris is tight and it's being pulled, right? It's being pulled at the hip itself, and then that's pulling the knee, which is causing extension. Whereas a rectus femoris muscle that is appropriately lengthened and it's not overactive, underactive. It's in decent condition. It's not over tight. It will actually allow the lower leg, the tibia fibula complex, to come down roughly 90 degrees versus having the foot way out. It's pretty cool. You can do it yourself. Do it on do it at kids' parties or something. Do it with your friends and family, and you'll see it's actually really cool. Somebody with really tight quadriceps or the rectus femoris, they will not show 90-degree flexion at the knee. Now, this is where the goniometer, if you're going to use one, of course, trainers, we're not going to use it, but this is where a goniometer would come in and you'd put it at the knee and you would catch the angle of flexion or extension, however you want to call it. And it's 110 degrees, right? It's not a right angle. It's actually the foot is out in front more. That tells you that the rectus femoris is over tight. Simple. Um, on the other hand, it could be that the iliopsoas is tight, and that's because then that's being interpreted because that leg that is on the bench is not able to go down far enough. That means that literally at the hip flexor itself, it's tight. And so now we move into, there's your observation. Observe whether the knee remains aligned straight or falls into internal external rotation. Yeah, that's all great. Interpretation, use the information. Okay, so now you got table 1013, and we're looking at the movement limitation, suspected muscle tightness. There it is. With the back and the sacrum, right? The lower back is flat. The back of the lowered thigh does not touch the table. Remember, that means that at the hip itself, those hip flexor muscles are really tight, and they're not allowing the thigh to go down and touch the table. Or the knee does not flex to 80 degrees. They're not even saying 90, they're saying 80 degrees. Okay, that means that the suspected muscle tightness is the primary hip flexor muscles. And that, of course, would be just in general, the entirety of the hip flexor complex. Now, with the back and the sacrum flat, the back of the lower thigh does not touch the table, but the knee does flex to 80. Remember, we just talked about this. So the thigh doesn't go down, but the lower leg is actually able to flex. Well, that tells you something about the rectus femoris. If it can flex down 80 degrees, the rectus femoris is good, but it's probably the iliopsoas that are tight. And look at this. The iliopsoas, which is preventing the hip from rotating posteriorly and inhibiting the thigh from being able to touch the table. All right, these are two joints we're looking at. We're looking at the knee joint and the hip joint itself. And that's what the Thomas test is really allowing you to do, is to check the muscles working over the two joints themselves. Now it's the opposite. The next one is the opposite with the back and sacrum flat. The back of the lowered thigh does touch the table. Okay, well, that tells you that the iliopsoas is probably not over tight. It's fine, right? Otherwise, that thigh would not be allowed to move down and go into hip extension. Okay. However, the thigh does not flex 80 degrees, and there it is. If the lower leg does not get down to 80 degrees of flexion, but it's being pulled, extended, that means that your rectus femoris is over tight. So either both those muscles are tight, and you're not going to touch the back of the leg down, and you're not going to flex to 80 degrees. They're both tight. Oh, and by the way, you got to do it with both legs, just so you know. Um, or one is tight and the other isn't, or this one's tight and this one isn't. So those are your three options. And that's what the Thomas test is helping you to basically determine. Simple, easy way to get an idea of whether the individual has over tight hip flexors or an over tight rectus femoris muscle. I don't recommend getting a goniometer. It's not going to make much sense. Anyway, you could literally make a little note. Hip flexors tight, iliopsoas tight, rectus femoris fine, or rectus femoris tight, over tight, iliopsoas fine, something like that. Good test. Doesn't take more than a couple of minutes to do it. Just remember to be safe when you're holding and allowing your client to go back. Remember, it's critically important that they pull the knee to their chest without squeezing it too hard, but pulling it just enough as you can look down up underneath to make sure that they no longer have the lordotic curve, that it flattens out. That forces the other side now to give you the interpretation that you need, that we've just discussed. So if you got any questions, I hope that was helpful, by the way. Hope it was helpful. And if it was, write the word understand in the comment section below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. Share it. Give us a thumbs up if it was helpful. Let us know how we can be of more assistance to you in helping you pass the ACE exam. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. Bye.